Marlene was 67 years old when 39 years of marriage disappeared into a courier-delivered envelope and a bank account showing $11. Howard had already moved the savings, the retirement fund, and everything they had quietly built together, and then moved Kayla, a woman 26 years his junior, into the home where Marlene had raised their children. Her son stopped returning her calls. Her daughter said she needed space. And when Marlene stepped onto 5 overgrown acres that no one had legally claimed in 50 years, every person who heard about it said the same thing: she had finally lost her mind. They were about to be proven spectacularly wrong. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Marlene Caldwell had not always been invisible. In the autumn of 1979, she had been the kind of woman people noticed, not for her appearance, though she was striking in a quiet, unhurried way, but for the passion with which she talked about soil. She was completing her second year of graduate study at the University of Vermont, pursuing a master's degree in ecology with a deep concentration in mycology, the science of fungi, and she could hold an entire seminar room completely still with a single observation about what lived and breathed beneath the forest floor. Her thesis research focused on mycorrhizal networks, the elaborate underground fungal systems that connect trees across vast distances, exchange nutrients between species, and function as something remarkably close to a nervous system for entire living ecosystems. She believed, with the kind of conviction that only comes from years of careful study, that healthy soil was not merely dirt, but a thriving, breathing community of organisms, and that the right fungal conditions could transform even the most exhausted, neglected land into something extraordinary. She had real plans back then, a research position perhaps at a land conservation institute, or a role with the Natural Resources Conservation Service, studying how degraded agricultural land could be rehabilitated, not through chemical inputs, but through biological restoration, through carefully reintroducing the fungal communities that decades of industrial farming had systematically wiped out. It was considered niche work in 1979. It was the kind of work that, decades later, the scientific community would call quietly visionary. Then she met Howard. He was not a student. He was 8 years her senior, already building what would become a well-regarded regional investment firm in Hartford, Connecticut, and he walked into the faculty mixer where Marlene was presenting her preliminary research findings with the easy, unhurried confidence of a man who had never once questioned his right to occupy any room he entered. He was charming in the particular way that certain men are charming, intensely attentive without ever being truly present, persuasive without appearing to apply any effort whatsoever. He asked her careful, intelligent questions about her research and seemed genuinely captivated by her answers, which she later came to understand had less to do with mycorrhizal biology and more to do with his remarkable, almost instinctive ability to make whoever he was speaking to feel like the only person alive in the world. They dated for 8 months. Then Howard said the words that would quietly, irrevocably redirect the entire course of Marlene's life. "Vermont is beautiful," he told her one quiet evening in late spring, "but my firm needs me in Hartford. I need to be there full-time, and I want you with me. You're brilliant, Marlene. You can finish your research anywhere, transfer your credits, complete your thesis by correspondence, whatever it takes. Come with me, we'll build something together." She believed him. She was 28 years old and deeply in love, and those two conditions combined are sufficient to make almost anyone believe almost anything they are told. She did not finish her degree, not right away, she promised herself, with the sincere confidence of someone who fully intends to keep a promise they will not keep. They moved to Hartford in the spring of 1980. Marlene found a part-time position as a laboratory technician at a regional agricultural cooperative, fully intending to save money and return to her studies within a year, 2 at the most. Then Marcus arrived in 1982, 14 months ahead of any plan either of them had made, and the laboratory position ended because the cooperative offered no maternity leave, and Howard suggested, gently but with unmistakable finality, that it made far more sense financially for her to remain at home. His salary was accelerating, childcare was expensive. They could always revisit the question of her career later, once the children were a little older and life had settled. Later. That word again. It would follow Marlene for the next 4 decades like a shadow she could never quite outrun. Ingrid arrived in 1985. By then, Marlene had settled into a life whose boundaries she had not consciously designed, but had somehow agreed to at every small, reasonable-seeming step along the way. She managed the household, managed the children, managed Howard's professional calendar and his client dinners and the quietly exhausting invisible labor of making a driven, ambitious man's life run without friction so that he could focus entirely on building an empire of his own. She performed this work with competence and grace and very little acknowledgement, because she had been raised to understand that a good marriage required sacrifice from both sides, and she was committed to doing her part. What she failed to fully reckon with in those early years of genuine optimism was that she appeared to be the only one making that calculation. Howard's investment firm expanded steadily through the 80s and 90s. He brought on senior staff, established partnerships with regional banks, joined the boards of civic institutions, and gradually became the kind of man whose name appeared in the Hartford Business Journal with the satisfying regularity of someone who had made success look inevitable. Marlene attended his events and smiled in the photographs and memorized the names of his clients' spouses and remembered their children's birthdays and served, year after patient year, as the invisible foundation of a life that looked, from any reasonable outside angle, like an unqualified American success story. Her mycology textbooks remained in a box in the basement of their house on Fieldstone Drive. For a while she subscribed to a soil science journal and read it late at night when the house went quiet, finding in its dense academic pages something that still flickered faintly like recognition. But gradually even that small private ritual fell away, crowded out by school board meetings and home renovation decisions and the slow, heavy accumulation of a life lived almost entirely in service to someone else's ambitions and someone else's future. She told herself she was happy. On the better days, she almost believed it. The first indication that something fundamental had shifted came in the early months of 2019, when Howard began staying late at his office with a regularity that did not correspond to anything on his professional calendar. Marlene noticed the way women who have spent decades paying exquisitely careful attention to the rhythms of another person's life always notice, but she said nothing for a long time. Hope, she had quietly learned over the years, was sometimes nothing more than a delay of grief. By January of 2022, the divorce papers had been drawn up by attorneys Howard had apparently been consulting for some months in advance. By March, Marlene had signed them in a lawyer's office that felt like the coldest room she had ever been inside. By April, Howard had moved Kayla Drummond, 34 years old, a project manager at one of his firm's client companies, into the house on Fieldstone Drive where Marlene had raised 2 children, planted a garden, and invested the best and most devoted years of her life. And Marlene was standing on the sidewalk outside it with 2 suitcases, a box of photograph albums, and a bank balance of $11, the overlooked remnant of a personal checking account Howard had somehow missed in his otherwise methodical financial reorganization before the divorce. $11. 39 years, and a silence from her son and daughter that was heavier and more defeating than anything Howard had ever said to her directly. She stood there for a long moment, looking at the house she no longer had any legal right to enter. Then she picked up her suitcases, put them in the back of her 13-year-old sedan, and drove away from Fieldstone Drive for the last time, with no clear destination, no plan, and $11 to her name. But somewhere beneath the devastation, something else was beginning to stir. Something she had not felt in a very long time. Clarity. The first place Marlene slept after leaving Fieldstone Drive was a budget motel 40 minutes outside Hartford, the kind of place with thin walls and a parking lot that hummed with fluorescent light all night. It cost $62 per night, which meant that her $11 covered approximately 11% of one evening, and which meant that the emergency credit card she had never once used in 39 years of marriage was now the only thing standing between her and a car seat. She lay on the motel bed that first night and did not cry. She had expected to cry. Instead, she felt something stranger and harder to name, a vast, echoless quiet, as if the part of her that had been bracing for impact for the last 3 years had finally, upon impact arriving, simply gone still. She called Marcus the next morning. He answered on the 4th ring, which she later recognized as a small mercy, because it was the last time he answered at all. "Mom." His voice was careful in the way voices are careful when someone has already decided what they are and are not willing to say. "I heard you and Dad finalized everything. I'm in a motel," Marlene said. "I don't have anywhere to go yet. I was wondering if we could talk." There was a pause. "I think you should give yourself some time to process. Dad did what he had to do legally. He was actually generous, from what I understand." Marlene was quiet for a moment. "He moved another woman into our home, Marcus, the home where I raised you." "I know this is painful," her son said, "but Dad's not the villain here. These things happen in marriages. People grow apart." She wanted to say a great many things. She said none of them. "I see," was all she offered, and she ended the call before the silence could become something she couldn't take back. Ingrid was more emotionally present and ultimately no more helpful. She called 2 days later, her voice carrying the particular strained warmth of someone delivering a difficult verdict as kindly as possible. "Mom, I love you. I want you to know that. But Marcus and I have talked, and we think it's important that we don't take sides. Dad is still our father. What happened between the two of you is between the two of you." "I'm not asking you to take sides," Marlene said. "I'm asking you to acknowledge that I exist." "Of course you exist, Mom. We just think—" "Ingrid." Marlene's voice was steadier than she felt. "I am 67 years old. I have $11, and I am living in a motel. I am not asking you to choose. I am asking you to care." Another careful pause. "We do care. We just think you need to find your footing independently right now. It'll be good for you." Marlene thanked her daughter for calling and did not hear from either of her children again for a very long time. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The weeks that followed were an education in how quickly financial desperation concentrates the mind. Marlene had no income beyond a small pension from 3 years of work as a soil laboratory assistant at the cooperative, a position she had left when Marcus was born and never returned to. That pension paid $480 per month. The motel cost $62 a night. The arithmetic was not complicated, and it was not encouraging. She moved into a cheaper extended stay facility after the first week, smaller, grimmer, with a kitchenette that smelled permanently of someone else's cooking. She applied for every position she could find that didn't require recent employment history: retail clerk, library assistant, greenhouse attendant. She was called back for exactly none of them. At 67, with a resume gap of 4 decades, she was, in the language of the hiring market, not a competitive candidate. She had approximately 8 months of financial runway if she was rigorous about every dollar. After that, she had no plan. It was during the 5th week, at 2 in the morning, with the extended stay kitchenette light casting everything in a pale, unflattering glow, that Marlene opened her laptop and began searching county property listings within a 100-mile radius. Not because she had any coherent strategy, but because doing something felt marginally better than lying awake doing nothing. She filtered for the lowest prices first, a habit born of necessity. Most results were either clearly fraudulent or attached to land so remote it was effectively inaccessible. She scrolled past dozens of listings with the mechanical persistence of someone who has stopped expecting to find anything useful. Then she stopped scrolling. The listing was 3 lines long and almost comically sparse. 4.8 acres, Grenville Township, Colebrook County. Unimproved. No structures. No utilities. No road access. Tax delinquent parcel, unclaimed 50+ years. County auction reserve $400. Serious inquiries only. $400. Marlene read it 3 times. Then she read it a 4th time, more slowly, paying attention to different words. Unclaimed. 50 years. $400. She sat with that for a long moment in the kitchenette light. Then she opened a new tab and searched for Grenville Township. Grenville Township was not on any map Marlene had ever consulted, which she discovered was less a navigational inconvenience and more an accurate reflection of the township's general relationship with the outside world. It existed in the northeastern corner of Colebrook County, a part of rural Vermont that had been quietly depopulating since the 1970s, its small farms folding one by one as the economics of agriculture shifted against anyone working fewer than several hundred acres. The nearest town of any consequence was a village called Harwick, population just under 2,000, with a single diner, a hardware store, and a county administrative office that was open Tuesday through Thursday and closed on every holiday Marlene had ever heard of, and several she had not. She drove up on a Wednesday morning in late May, her sedan loaded with a road atlas, a thermos of coffee, and the kind of cautious, disciplined hope she had learned to keep very small so that disappointment could not use it against her. The county roads narrowed progressively as she drove north, the pavement giving way to packed gravel and then to a rutted dirt track that ran through dense second-growth forest for nearly 2 miles before depositing her at a rusted metal gate standing open on a broken hinge. A faded orange notice had been stapled to a nearby post, a county tax delinquency notice, weathered to near illegibility, dated 4 years prior. Marlene got out of the car and stood in the morning air, which smelled of pine resin and damp earth and something older underneath both of those things. She pushed through the gate and walked onto the land. It was nothing like she had imagined, which is to say it was simultaneously worse and far more interesting. The 4.8 acres were almost entirely consumed by 50 years of unmanaged growth, dense tangles of wild shrub, stands of young birch and maple that had seeded and grown entirely without human interference, patches of fern so thick they reached her waist in places, and fallen timber in various stages of decomposition lying across what might once have been cleared ground. There was no visible path. There was no structure of any kind remaining, though she found, near what she estimated was the center of the property, a low rectangular depression in the earth and a scatter of old fieldstone that suggested a foundation. Something had stood here once, long enough ago that the forest had nearly finished erasing it. It was overgrown beyond anything a conventional buyer would consider workable. It was inaccessible. It was without utilities, without water infrastructure, without any of the features that made raw land legible as an investment. Marlene could see immediately and clearly why no one had claimed it in 50 years. She could also see something that no one who hadn't spent years studying soil biology would have thought to look for. She knelt at the base of a large decomposing birch log and pressed her fingers into the dark soil beneath it. It was soft, genuinely deeply soft in a way that compacted, depleted land simply is not, the kind of softness that takes decades of undisturbed organic accumulation to produce. She lifted a handful and held it close, examining the texture. Threaded through the dark matter were the thin, pale filaments she had spent 2 years of graduate study learning to recognize. Mycelium, fungal networks, extensive ones, running through the soil in every direction she probed. 50 years of complete human absence had not ruined this land. It had restored it. The forest had done, without any assistance, precisely what Marlene had once written her thesis about, rebuilt the underground biological infrastructure that makes soil genuinely alive. The mycorrhizal networks lacing through this ground were not merely present. They were, by any reasonable assessment, extraordinary. She stood up slowly, turned in a full circle, and looked at the overgrowth with entirely different eyes. Other people had looked at this property and seen abandonment. Marlene was looking at it and seeing 50 years of uninterrupted biological recovery. She was seeing soil that most farmers would spend a decade and a fortune trying to artificially recreate. She was seeing the precise conditions that certain high-value gourmet and medicinal mushroom species required to thrive. Conditions that could not be manufactured quickly or cheaply. Conditions that this land had been quietly developing all on its own since before Marlene had even enrolled at the University of Vermont. She walked the full perimeter twice, taking notes in the small notebook she had brought. She collected soil samples from 6 different locations, sealing them in the Ziploc bags she had packed almost as an afterthought. She identified 3 separate areas where the canopy opened enough to allow substantial light penetration, critical for certain cultivation approaches she was already beginning to mentally sketch. She spent 4 hours on that land before she walked back to her car. She sat in the driver's seat for a long moment, looking at the gate in her rearview mirror. Then she called the Colebrook County Administrative Office and asked how to register for the upcoming tax auction. The Colebrook County Tax Auction was held on the 2nd Thursday of June in a municipal meeting room that smelled of old carpet and institutional coffee. Marlene arrived 20 minutes early and sat in a folding chair near the back, holding a numbered bidding paddle and the particular focused calm of someone who has already made their decision and is simply waiting for the formality to conclude. She had spent the 3 weeks between her visit to the property and the auction doing 2 things simultaneously. The first was research, methodical, obsessive, conducted mostly between midnight and 3 in the morning on her laptop in the extended stay kitchenette. She pulled up every academic paper she could access on gourmet and medicinal mushroom cultivation, cross-referencing species requirements with what she had observed in her soil samples and canopy assessments. She contacted a soil testing laboratory in Burlington and mailed her 6 samples, receiving results that confirmed what her fingers had already told her. The mycorrhizal density in that ground was genuinely exceptional, the organic matter content well above regional averages, the pH levels ideal for the cultivation of species like lion's mane, maitake and reishi, all of which commanded serious prices in the specialty food and herbal supplement markets. The second thing she did was figure out where $400 was going to come from. She had, after 6 weeks of careful rationing, approximately $900 remaining on her emergency credit card. Spending $400 of it on land that had no road, no water, and no structures was not a decision any financial advisor would have endorsed. Marlene made it anyway, with the same quiet, unshakable certainty she had felt standing in the forest with dark soil between her fingers. Some decisions, she had come to understand, are not financial, they are biological. They are the organism finally turning toward the light. There were 11 registered bidders at the auction. The Grenville Township parcel came up 7th on the agenda, described by the county administrator in the flat, legally cautious language of someone trying very hard not to misrepresent a piece of land that had defeated every previous owner. No utilities, no structures, no road access. Reserve price $400. 2 bidders dropped immediately. A third made a single offer of $450 before shaking his head and setting his paddle down. Marlene bid $500, more to establish momentum than from any particular strategic calculation, and the room went quiet. The administrator looked around once, twice. No further bids materialized. The gavel came down. Marlene Caldwell was the legal owner of 4.8 acres of land that no one had wanted for 50 years. She sat in the parking lot afterward and allowed herself exactly 4 minutes of something that was not quite happiness, but was close enough to matter. Then she drove back to the extended stay motel and called her children. Marcus did not answer. She left a voicemail that was brief and factual. She had purchased land in Colebrook County and intended to develop it into a working farm. She wished him well. She did not expect a callback and did not receive one. Ingrid answered on the second ring, which briefly lifted Marlene's heart before her daughter spoke. "Mom, I've been meaning to call. I heard from Marcus that you've been struggling. Are you okay?" "I'm better than okay," Marlene said. "I just bought land. I'm going to build something." A silence that Marlene had learned to read very accurately over 67 years. "What kind of land?" "Just under 5 acres in Vermont, undeveloped. I'm going to cultivate mushrooms, gourmet and medicinal varieties. The soil conditions are extraordinary." Another silence, longer this time. "Mom, you're 67. You're going to live on undeveloped land and grow mushrooms." "Yes, that's..." Ingrid stopped. When she continued, her voice had shifted into the careful, modulated register that Marlene recognized as her daughter managing her own discomfort by reframing it as concern. "Mom, I think you might be in more distress than you're acknowledging. Have you spoken to anyone? A counselor, or even just a doctor?" "I've spoken to a soil laboratory in Burlington," Marlene said. "The mycorrhizal density readings were exceptional." "I'm serious. So am I, Ingrid." Her daughter exhaled. "I just don't want you to make a decision that you can't recover from." Marlene considered that for a moment. "I spent 39 years making decisions I couldn't recover from," she said finally. "This one feels different." She moved onto the land 12 days later, arriving in her sedan with a 2-person tent, a sleeping bag rated to 40 degrees, a camp stove, a portable water filter, 5 gallons of water in containers, and a single cardboard box containing her old graduate school mycology textbooks, retrieved at last from the storage unit where they had been sitting since 1985. She set up her tent in the most level clearing she could find, within sight of the old fieldstone foundation. Then she knelt in the soil, pressed both palms flat against the earth, and got to work. The first thing Marlene did every morning on the land was nothing. She sat outside her tent in the early light with her coffee and her notebook, and she listened. This was not idleness. It was the practice she had learned in graduate school from a professor who had spent 30 years studying forest ecosystems and who had told his students with the seriousness of someone conveying something genuinely important that you cannot understand a living system until you have been quiet inside it long enough for it to forget you are there. Marlene had been 23 when she heard that. She was 67 now, and she understood it in a way her younger self could not have. The land had a language. She was learning to read it. In the first 2 weeks she did nothing but walk and observe and document. She mapped the property in careful sections, recording which tree species grew where, how water moved across the terrain during the heavy June rains, where the canopy thinned and where it closed, which areas of the forest floor showed the richest accumulation of decomposed organic matter. She noted where the mycelium was densest, identifying locations by the particular dark, crumbling quality of the soil and the presence of visible fungal fruiting bodies emerging from rotting logs. She filled 2 notebooks entirely with observations and sketches before she moved a single stone or cut a single branch. Her body, meanwhile, was registering significant objections. Marlene had been what she privately described as comfortably sedentary for the better part of 2 decades. Howard's social life had not required physical exertion, and the rhythms of managing a household had kept her moving but not strong. Now she was sleeping on the ground, hauling water containers from her car, and spending 8 to 10 hours daily doing the kind of sustained physical work that used muscles she had genuinely forgotten she possessed. Her back protested every morning with the blunt insistence of a creditor who has run out of patience. Her hands blistered, then calloused. Her knees, which had never previously expressed opinions, began to express them with considerable force. She kept working. The first major project was access, a rudimentary path cleared from the gate to the central clearing where she had set up camp, wide enough for her car to navigate carefully. This required cutting back years of encroaching growth, moving fallen timber, and laying down sections of salvaged wooden pallet across 2 soft, wet patches that the June rains had turned effectively impassable. It took 11 days. When she finally drove her sedan through to the clearing for the first time, she sat behind the wheel for a moment with her hands still on it, feeling something she hadn't felt in years, the specific satisfaction of a problem solved entirely by your own effort. The water situation required more creativity. A well was financially impossible. Drilling costs in Vermont ran between $15,000 and $30,000 with no guarantee of hitting water at a workable depth. Marlene designed a rainwater collection system instead, salvaging large food-grade barrels from a commercial kitchen supplier in Harwick who was happy to offload them for $20 each. She built a simple collection frame from lumber she bought used, angled to direct rainfall into the barrels through a basic filtration system she constructed from layered gravel, sand, and activated charcoal, following instructions she found in a decades-old homesteading manual she'd picked up at a Harwick thrift store for $1.50. When the first full barrel filled during a 3-day rain in late June, Marlene stood in the downpour and let it soak her completely, because there was no one watching and it seemed like the right response to the occasion. The mushroom cultivation was where her real knowledge began to surface, slowly at first, then with gathering momentum, like a language she had not spoken in 40 years coming back not word by word, but in whole sentences. She started with what the land was already producing. Her surveys had identified multiple established colonies of oyster mushrooms and hen of the woods growing wild on the decomposing timber throughout the property. She did not harvest these. Instead, she used them as what they were: inoculation sources, living libraries of the fungal genetics already adapted to her specific soil conditions. She collected tissue samples and began culturing them on sterilized grain substrate in mason jars she pressure cooked on her camp stove, following protocols from her graduate school training that she had not applied in practice since 1980, but that returned to her hands with a muscle memory that surprised and moved her in equal measure. She was on her knees examining a particularly promising log inoculation site one afternoon in early July when she heard footsteps on her new path and looked up to find a man in his early 70s standing at the edge of the clearing with his hands in his jacket pockets, watching her with the particular respectful curiosity of someone who recognizes competence when they see it. "You're the one who bought the Grenville parcel," he said. Marlene sat back on her heels. "I am. Earl Dempsey," he said. "Retired soil conservationist, 41 years with the NRCS. He looked around the clearing with a slow, assessing gaze. "Mind if I take a look at what you're doing here?" Earl Dempsey became a fixture on the Grenville parcel within 2 weeks of that first afternoon. He had heard about Marlene the way that small rural communities transmit information, not through any single conversation, but through a kind of collective osmosis. A detail mentioned at the Harwick hardware counter passed to someone at the diner, repeated at the county extension office, until the story had traveled far enough to reach a retired soil conservationist who lived 12 minutes away and who had, since his wife's passing 2 years prior, been looking for something worthwhile to do with the considerable knowledge he was no longer being paid to apply. He was not the kind of man who offered help loudly. He showed up, looked carefully at what Marlene was doing, and then asked precise, technically informed questions that made clear within the first 10 minutes that his 41 years with the Natural Resources Conservation Service had left him with a depth of practical knowledge that complemented her own in ways that felt almost architecturally deliberate. Where Marlene's expertise ran deep into the biological, the fungal networks, the soil chemistry, the cultivation science, Earl's ran wide across the structural, drainage engineering, land grading, access road construction, water sourcing, the bureaucratic landscape of permits and agricultural designations that Marlene had not yet begun to navigate. He never suggested she was doing anything wrong. He offered alternatives the way a good mentor offers them, as possibilities rather than corrections, phrased as questions rather than instructions. What would happen, he wondered aloud one afternoon, if she graded that low corner slightly differently, directing more of the rainfall runoff toward the collection area rather than away from it? Had she considered applying for an agricultural land designation, which would reduce her property tax burden significantly? Did she know that a neighbor 2 miles north had a working well she might be able to negotiate access to for the short term? Marlene found, to her own cautious surprise, that she trusted him. Not immediately. Her capacity for trust had taken serious structural damage over the previous year, and she was not inclined to rebuild it quickly. But Earl's manner was so entirely without agenda, so plainly motivated by genuine interest in the work itself, that resistance gradually became more effort than it was worth. They developed a rhythm. He came 3 or 4 mornings a week, arriving with coffee in a thermos and leaving before midday. He connected her with a regional agricultural cooperative, introduced her to a specialty food distributor in Burlington who was actively seeking locally cultivated gourmet mushrooms, and helped her file the paperwork for organic certification, a process that required detailed documentation and a formal site inspection, but that would, Earl explained carefully, more than double the price she could command for her harvest. By September, Marlene had her first viable cultivation beds established across nearly half an acre of prepared ground. The lion's mane colonies were already showing early pinning, the first signs of fruiting body development, and her reishi logs were progressing on exactly the schedule her cultivation notes had projected. The mycorrhizal density of the soil was doing precisely what she had believed it would do, supporting fungal growth rates that were measurably above what the published cultivation literature suggested as typical for first-season production. She had, against every reasonable prediction, begun to make something extraordinary out of ground that 50 years of collective indifference had accidentally made perfect. That was when Howard appeared. She heard his car before she saw him, the particular sound of an expensive engine navigating an unpaved road with reluctant care. He emerged from between the trees looking precisely as he always had, well dressed in the specific way of men who equate appearance with authority, slightly uncomfortable in any environment his money had not arranged in advance. He looked at the clearing, at the cultivation beds, at the structure Marlene had been gradually building from salvaged materials, and she could see him recalibrating his expectations in real time. "Marlene," he said her name with the rehearsed warmth of someone who has practiced a tone in advance. "I had to ask around in Harwick to find you. You're not easy to locate." "I'm not trying to be located," she said. She did not put down the cultivation tool she was holding. "What do you want, Howard?" He looked around the clearing again, more slowly this time, and she recognized the specific quality of his attention. Not admiration, not curiosity, but assessment. The way he had always looked at things he was considering acquiring. "I've been hearing things," he said, "about what you're doing out here. Someone in Harwick mentioned a distributor in Burlington that you might be selling commercially." "That's correct." He nodded slowly, as though this confirmed something. "I want to help. I could invest, help you scale this properly. You're working too hard for what you're producing." "With proper capital?" "No," Marlene said. Howard's expression shifted fractionally. "You haven't heard the offer." "I don't need to," she said. "There is no version of your involvement in this that I want. You need to leave." He left. But 3 weeks later, a certified letter arrived from a Hartford attorney. Howard was filing suit, claiming partial ownership of the property and its projected revenue on the grounds that the land had been acquired using assets from the divorce settlement, assets he now argued had been marital property improperly allocated. It was, as Marlene's attorney confirmed immediately, legally baseless, but baseless had never stopped Howard from trying before. Marlene's attorney was a woman named Patricia Osei who practiced out of a modest office above a pharmacy in Harwick and who had, over 23 years of rural Vermont legal work, developed the particular unsentimental clarity of someone who has seen every variety of human behavior and stopped being surprised by most of it. She read Howard's filing in approximately 4 minutes, set it down on her desk, and looked at Marlene with an expression that contained equal measures of professional assessment and quiet fury on her client's behalf. "This is harassment dressed in legal language," she said. "The settlement was final. The $3,100 remaining on your credit card at the time of purchase was unequivocally yours to use however you chose. He has no claim to anything you built after that settlement closed." "I know," Marlene said. "Can we beat it?" "Absolutely. But beating it costs money and time, and he knows that. He's not filing because he thinks he'll win. He's filing because he thinks you'll settle just to make it stop." Marlene looked at her steadily. "I won't settle." Patricia nodded once, the way someone nods when they hear an answer that changes the shape of a problem. "Then we fight. But you should understand, he has resources and a Hartford firm behind him. He can file motions, request documents, schedule depositions. He can make this slow and expensive and exhausting even while losing every single step of it." "I understand," Marlene said. What followed was 4 months that tested her in ways the physical hardship of building the farm had not. Legal correspondence arrived in steady, grinding waves, document requests, deposition notices, procedural motions that her attorney described as designed to generate billable hours rather than advance any legitimate legal argument. Marlene spent hours she should have been using to expand her cultivation beds, instead sitting at her salvage desk in the small structure she had built, responding to requests, organizing records, preparing for a deposition that Howard's attorneys ultimately cancelled and rescheduled 3 separate times. She paid Patricia from money she had earmarked for a small greenhouse she had been planning to build before winter. The greenhouse did not get built. The legal fees did. Her children made it worse, though she suspected they believed they were making it better. Marcus called once, his voice carrying the particular strained neutrality of someone delivering a prepared message. "Dad's really frustrated, Mom. He feels like you're being combative. If you could just have a conversation with him directly, maybe work something out, this whole situation could go away." Marlene was quiet for a moment. "Your father is suing me for land I bought with $11 and 3 months of sleeping in a tent," she said. "I'm not being combative. I'm being accurate. He says the settlement money was—" "Marcus." She kept her voice entirely level. "I am not going to discuss your father's legal strategy with you. If you call to ask how I'm doing fine. If you call to advocate for your father, I need you to stop." He stopped. He also stopped calling. Ingrid's approach was softer and landed harder. "Mom, I know you feel wronged, but is this farm worth destroying what's left of the family over?" Marlene sat with that question for a full 10 seconds before answering. "The family was not destroyed by this farm, Ingrid. It was destroyed significantly earlier than that, by choices none of which were mine. This farm is the first thing I have built for myself in 39 years. I am not surrendering it." The call ended without resolution, as most of their calls did now. What saved the situation came from a direction Marlene had not anticipated. A journalist named Cassandra Vreeland wrote for a regional publication called the Vermont Agricultural Review and had been working on a feature about unconventional land reclamation in Colebrook County. Earl had mentioned Marlene's work to someone at the county extension office, who had mentioned it to Cassandra, who had driven out to the Grenville parcel on a cold October morning with a camera and a recorder and an interviewer's instinct for when a story is larger than it first appears. Marlene had mentioned the lawsuit only briefly and factually as context for why certain planned expansions were running behind schedule. Cassandra, who had the trained journalist's habit of pulling lightly on threads that resist, asked 3 careful follow-up questions and then went away and did her research thoroughly. The article that published in November was not the agricultural feature Cassandra had originally planned. It was titled, "From Settlement to Soil: How a Vermont Woman Built a Farm from 50-year-old Land and Why Her Ex-Husband Wants Half of It." It detailed the divorce, the $11 starting point, the mycological science behind what Marlene had built, Earl's assessment of the land's agricultural significance, and the lawsuit's legal merits, which Cassandra's sources, including 2 independent attorneys she had consulted, described uniformly and unambiguously as negligible. The piece was shared widely and commented on extensively, and the comments were not favorable to Howard. Within 19 days, his attorneys filed to withdraw the suit. It was over. The land was hers. Everything she had built on it was hers. And something else was beginning, something she had not planned for and could not yet fully see the shape of, but that was growing with the same quiet, patient certainty as everything else on the Grenville parcel. The emails began arriving the week the article was shared. They came from women Marlene had never met, from towns and states she had no particular connection to, written in the specific register of people who do not normally write to strangers, but have been moved past that hesitation by something they recognize too deeply to ignore. Some were brief, a single paragraph, a name, a thank you that didn't elaborate because it didn't need to. Others ran to several pages, detailed and honest and raw in the way that people are raw when they finally find language for something they have been carrying without a name for years. Women in their 60s who had been told, in various ways and by various people, that their most productive years were behind them. Women who had set aside careers and ambitions and entire intellectual identities in service of marriages and families and households that had not, in the end, protected them from the specific devastation of being left with nothing at an age when starting over is not supposed to be possible. Women who had read about Marlene and $11 and 50 years of unclaimed land and felt, for the first time in a long time, that the story they were living might not be finished yet. Earl read several of the emails over Marlene's shoulder one morning and was quiet for a moment. Then he said carefully, the way he always said things he considered important, "Have you thought about teaching?" Marlene had not thought about teaching. She thought about it now. The first workshop she organized was deliberately modest, a single weekend session, Introduction to Fungal Cultivation and Soil Biology for Small Land Plots, advertised only through the Vermont Agricultural Review's online newsletter and a notice Earl posted at the county extension office. She expected 8 or 10 attendees. 19 women arrived, ranging in age from 54 to 73, most of them with some version of Marlene's story behind them, and all of them with the same quality of attention, the focused, hungry attention of people who have been waiting a long time for someone to take their capacity seriously. Marlene taught them about mycorrhizal networks and substrate preparation and the particular patience that fungal cultivation requires, the willingness to prepare conditions carefully and then trust the biology to do what biology does when it is properly supported. She taught them about reading soil, about what 50 years of undisturbed growth had done to her land and why, about the difference between what ground looks like and what it actually is. She shared her story without softening it, the $11, the tent, the legal fight, the children who had not called. At the end of the second day, 4 women asked when she would hold the next workshop. 2 asked if they could come back for an extended stay and learn more intensively. 1 asked if she had considered a formal internship structure. She had not. She considered it now. By the following spring, Second Soil Farm, the name had come to her at 3 in the morning with the quiet certainty of something that had always been true, was running quarterly workshops with a waiting list, hosting 2 seasonal interns at a time in a small bunkhouse Earl had helped her construct from reclaimed timber, and supplying lion's mane, maitake, and reishi mushrooms to 3 specialty distributors across Vermont and New Hampshire under a contract negotiated by Joanne Farrell, a small business development advisor the agricultural cooperative had connected Marlene with. Annual revenue from cultivation alone had reached $38,000. Workshop income added another 14. She was not wealthy. She was, for the first time in 4 decades, entirely and exclusively in charge of her own financial life. Dr. Priya Anand arrived that same spring, a mycologist from the University of Vermont whose research into native fungal biodiversity had brought her to Colebrook County, where Marlene's land had begun generating quiet attention in academic circles, following Earl's detailed notes to the county extension service. Dr. Anand spent 2 days walking the property, collecting samples, and asking Marlene questions that required her to articulate things she had previously only practiced. At the end of the second day, she asked if Marlene would consider allowing the parcel to be included in a long-term soil biodiversity study. Marlene agreed. Graduate students began appearing on Tuesdays and Fridays, careful and enthusiastic in the particular way of people who have recently discovered that science conducted outdoors is more interesting than science conducted in a laboratory. The farm was becoming something larger than Marlene had planned, which she was learning was how the best things grow, not according to the plan but beyond it, filling space you didn't know was available until the conditions were right. It was on a Thursday afternoon in October, during a workshop session on late-season harvesting, that Marlene looked up from demonstrating proper reishi harvest technique and saw a car she did not recognize parked at the gate. Two people climbed out. Her daughter Ingrid, moving carefully across the uneven ground in shoes entirely wrong for the terrain, and beside her, a girl of about 16 with Ingrid's dark eyes and something in her expression that Marlene recognized as genuine, unperformed curiosity. Marlene excused herself from the workshop and walked over. "Hi, Mom." Ingrid's voice carried the particular weight of someone who has been rehearsing a conversation and has now arrived at it. "This is my daughter, your granddaughter, Petra." She paused. She found the Agricultural Review article 6 months ago. She's been asking to come ever since. Petra looked at Marlene with the direct, unguarded gaze of a teenager who has not yet learned to make herself smaller in the presence of adults she finds impressive. "I read everything I could find about what you're doing here," she said. "The mycorrhizal density data is incredible. I want to study ecology. I wanted to meet you." Marlene looked at her granddaughter for a long moment. Then she said, "Come see the farm." She gave them the full tour: the cultivation beds, the drying and processing shed, the bunkhouse, the rainwater system, the old fieldstone foundation she had deliberately left uncovered as a reminder of what had been here before and what 50 years of patience had made possible. She introduced them to Earl, who shook Petra's hand with the seriousness he reserved for people he intended to take seriously. She let them sit in on the last hour of the workshop, watching 21 women learn to read soil and understand what lives inside it. When the workshop participants had gone and the three of them were standing alone in the clearing in the late afternoon light, Ingrid said quietly, "I owe you an apology. More than one." Marlene looked at her daughter, really looked, past the rehearsed words and the careful posture, at the person underneath both of those things. She saw genuine remorse. She saw someone who had made the easier choice when the harder one had been available and was now living with the weight of that. "You can be here now," Marlene said, "if you want to be, but I need you to understand something first." She said it gently, without anger, because the anger had composted itself into something more useful months ago. "I am not going back to being who I was. I am not going to manage your relationship with your father or make difficult things comfortable. I am done disappearing so that other people can be more visible." "I know," Ingrid said. "I don't want that person back. I want to know who you actually are." It was the beginning, not of the relationship they had lost, but of one they had not yet built. Something more honest, more mutual, more worth having. Marcus never called. Some distances, Marlene had come to understand, are chosen rather than circumstantial, and you cannot close a gap that someone is actively maintaining. She had made her peace with that in the way you make peace with weather, not by approving of it, but by building shelter sufficient to withstand it. Howard remarried Kayla in a ceremony Marlene heard about through Petra. She felt nothing about it that required any particular attention. Howard belonged to a chapter she had closed, and closed chapters do not require revisiting. On the 3rd anniversary of the day she had driven through that broken gate for the first time, Marlene held an open evening at Second Soil Farm. 60 people came, former workshop participants and current interns and Dr. Anand's graduate students and Earl and Joanne and Cassandra, who was working on a follow-up piece, and a dozen women who had driven from neighboring counties because they had read the original article and wanted to see in person what $11 and 50 years of unclaimed land could become. Earl gave a toast that was brief and accurate, which was the only kind of toast he knew how to give. Dr. Anand presented preliminary findings from the biodiversity study that made the graduate students visibly excited. 3 former workshop participants stood up and shared what they had built since: a small kitchen garden that had become a neighborhood composting cooperative, a community education program at a senior center in Burlington, a half-acre mushroom operation that had just signed its first commercial contract. Marlene stood at the edge of the clearing and watched it all. This community that had grown from 5 acres of abandoned ground and 40 years of shelved knowledge and one irrevocable decision made at 2 in the morning in a kitchenette that smelled of someone else's cooking. She thought about the mycorrhizal networks running beneath her feet at that very moment, invisible and essential, connecting everything to everything else in ways that looked like nothing from the surface but constituted, underneath, the living architecture of an entire ecosystem. She thought about what her graduate school professor had told her 44 years ago, that you cannot understand a living system until you have been quiet inside it long enough for it to forget you are there. She had been quiet for a very long time. The system had finally forgotten she was watching, and now she was growing. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.